The transport broke through the atmosphere of Varath Prime 3 days after the rescue, and the cheering crowds that greeted them at the landing pad made Jihei deeply uncomfortable. But she stood with her squad and accepted the attention, because that was what the moment required. Morks was still recovering from his wound, but he had insisted on walking off the ship under his own power. And he stood beside Jihei with his massive hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture that would have been unthinkable. A week ago, the story of the rescue had spread across the station faster than light could travel, and everyone knew about the human female who had killed a dozen Corveshi raiders and dragged a wounded comrade to safety while under fire. And the whispers that followed her now were very different from the ones she had heard before. Director Sarin waited for them at the edge of the crowd. And when the formal welcomes were complete, she summoned Jihei to a private meeting in her tower once again. "You performed admirably, Cadet," the ancient Quilla said, and there was warmth in her voice that had not been there before. "I did what was necessary. Director, you did considerably more than that. And the entire coalition knows it now." Sarin moved to her window and gazed out at the stars. "I have been in communication with the coalition, High Council, since your return, and we have reached a decision that I wanted to share with you personally before the public announcement." Jihei waited. "We will be expanding our human exchange program significantly," Sarin continued. "More humans will train alongside our species, not because we need weapons, but because we need teachers. Teachers." Sarin turned to face her. "Humans understand violence better than any species in known space. You have been studying it and practicing it and surviving it for your entire existence. And more importantly, you understand how to live with its consequences. You know the cost of fighting because you have paid it over and over again." She stepped closer to Jihei. "The coalition has always approached conflict as a necessary evil to be minimized, but humans approach it as a fundamental truth to be mastered. And I believe we have much to learn from that perspective. Director, I am not sure I am qualified to teach anyone anything. You are being offered a position. Cadet Yun, combat instructor for the academy. You would be the first human to hold such a role." Jihei was silent for a long moment, and conflicting emotions warred across her face. "I need time to think about this, of course. But may I ask what troubles you about the offer?" "I am afraid," Jihei admitted, "not of fighting or dying, but of teaching others to be like humans. What if I create monsters? What if I spread the very violence that has cursed my species for its entire history?" Sarin smiled, and it was a sad and knowing expression. "That fear is precisely why you are the right choice." The door opened, and Kethvaros entered without waiting for permission, and his scarred face was thoughtful as he approached. "I apologize for the interruption, Director, but I wish to speak with Cadet Yun." Sarin nodded and stepped aside. Kethvaros stopped before Jihei and studied her with his 4 ancient eyes. "I have been a warrior for 300 years, he said. "I have fought in campaigns across this galaxy, and I have trained thousands of soldiers. And I thought I understood combat as well as anyone could." He paused. "I was wrong. Instructor, when the raiders attacked and Morvax fell, I calculated the odds of saving him. The mathematics said it was foolish to try. One casualty was acceptable if it meant preserving the rest of the squad. And I was preparing to order a fighting retreat when you moved." He shook his head slowly. "You did not calculate. You simply acted. You saw a comrade in danger, and you went to him without hesitation. And you killed everything that stood in your way. While dragging his wounded body to safety, I could not leave him behind. I know, and that is what I do not understand. Or rather, what I did not understand until I thought about it more carefully." Kethvaros placed one of his 4 hands on Jihai's shoulder. "You pulled Morvax to safety because that is who you are. Not because it was tactically sound or mathematically optimal, but because humans do not abandon their people. You would rather die trying to save a comrade than live knowing you left them behind." He looked at Sorin. That is what she should teach. Director, not the killing or the speed or the accuracy, but the reason behind it all, the willingness to fight for something beyond survival. Sorin nodded. That is precisely what I was trying to explain. Ketvaros turned back to Jihei. I was wrong about humans. I thought you were dangerous because of your weapons and your reflexes. But I understand now that those things are just tools. The truly dangerous thing about humans is that you decided a long time ago that some things are worth dying for. And you have been fighting for those things ever since. He stepped back and straightened to attention. If you accept this position, I would be honored to serve alongside you. Jihei looked at him, and then at Sorin. And then at the stars beyond the window. She thought about Earth and all the wars her people had fought. And she thought about the blood they had spilled and the tears they had shed. And she thought about the long, slow climb from violence toward something. Better, she thought about Morvax lying wounded on the floor and the look in his eyes when she came back for him, and she made her decision. I accept. 2 weeks later, Jihei stood before her first class of students, and alien faces watched her from the training hall with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear to hope. She drew her K5 pistol and set it on the table before. This weapon is not what makes humans dangerous, she told them, and her voice carried clearly across the chamber. Many species have powerful weapons. Many can match our speed and accuracy with enough training. What makes us dangerous is something else entirely. She paused and looked at each of them in turn. Humans decided a long time ago that some things are worth dying for. Our families, our friends, our ideals, our future. And once we made that decision, we became unstoppable, not because we could not be killed, but because killing us was never enough to make us stop. She picked up the pistol and holstered it. Today, I will begin teaching you how to find those things for yourselves. Not what to fight for, that is your choice, but how to fight for what matters to you. How to move without hesitation when the moment comes. How to choose action over calculation when someone you care about is in danger. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since arriving at the academy. I cannot promise it will be easy. I cannot promise you will survive, but I can promise that when you find something worth fighting for, you will understand why humans have endured everything the universe has thrown at us and kept going. The students leaned forward in their seats, and Jihei saw the spark of something kindling in their eyes. From the doorway, Ketvaros watched with his arms folded, and beside him stood Morvax with his wound still healing, and Elenice with her crystalline face reflecting the light, and for the first time in decades, the ancient Sauran warrior felt something he had thought war had burned out of him. Forever hope, because humans had brought something new to the coalition. Not just weapons or tactics or the ability to kill. They had brought the conviction that fighting could mean something more than survival, and that was worth more than all the firepower in the galaxy. The transport ship cut through the void of space toward the silent outpost, and inside its cramped hold, 8 cadets sat in combat harnesses while Instructor Ketvaros reviewed the mission briefing one final time. Was seated between Elenice and a Torvian named Vrex, and across from her Morvax filled nearly 2 seats with his armored bulk, and his 4 eyes kept finding her face, as if he still could not quite believe what he had witnessed in the training hall. Listen carefully, Ketvaros announced, his voice cutting through the hum of the engines. The outpost is a Class 3 research station with a crew of 47. The last transmission mentioned Corveshi raiders before going silent, and we have no information on enemy numbers or disposition. He brought up a holographic map of the station. We will enter through the secondary airlock here and proceed to the central operations hub. Our primary objective is to locate survivors and secure an evacuation route. Combat is expected but should be avoided when possible. Corveshi raiders do not leave survivors, Morvax said grimly. Everyone knows this. Then we will confirm their deaths and gather intelligence on enemy movements, Kethvaros replied. But we will not assume the worst until we see it with our own eyes. Understood. The cadets murmured their acknowledgement. One more thing, the instructor added. And his gaze found Jihei. Cadet Yoon will be on point. Morvax's head snapped up. The human. You want the human leading us into combat. I want the fastest and most accurate shooter, leading us into an unknown hostile environment. Do you have a problem with that assessment, Cadet Morvax? The Drethian's jaw tightened. But he shook his head. No, instructor. Good. We dock in 15 minutes. Prepare yourselves. The transport settled against the outpost's secondary airlock with a gentle thump. And the cadets moved into position with weapons drawn. And Jihei took her place at the front of the formation with her K5 pistol in her hands. The airlock cycled open, and darkness greeted them. Emergency lighting flickered along the corridor beyond, painting everything in shades of red and shadow. And the air smelled of smoke, and something else that Jihei recognized from Earthbludge. She moved forward in a low crouch, her footsteps silent on the metal floor, and the others followed in the pattern they had trained. Covering angles and watching for movement, they found the first body 50 meters in it was a Velothi researcher, and her crystalline skin had been shattered by brutal impact wounds, and her dead eyes stared at nothing. And Eleni's made a soft sound of grief, but kept moving. More bodies followed, scattered through the corridors like broken toys. And the Corveshi had not been kind to their victims. And Jihei saw wounds that spoke of cruelty rather than necessity. They enjoyed this, Rex whispered, his tentacles curling with revulsion. Corveshi always do, Kethvaros replied grimly. Keep moving. They reached the central hub and found it sealed from inside. And someone had barricaded the doors with whatever furniture was available. And faint sounds of movement came from within survivors. Eleni's breathed. Kethvaros moved to the door panel and began working on the override. And while he did, Jihei scanned the surrounding corridors. And something about the shadows ahead made her uneasy. Instructor, she said quietly. We are not alone. Before he could respond, the Corveshi attacked. They came from 3 directions at once, bursting from side corridors, with weapons raised and battle cries tearing from their throats. And there were at least 20 of them. Massive humanoids covered in bone-like protrusions, with eyes that gleamed with savage intelligence. The cadets opened fire, and the corridor became a storm of energy blasts and screaming aliens. And Coalition training took over as they formed a defensive perimeter around the sealed door. Jihei moved without thinking. Her first 3 shots took down the lead raiders before they could close to melee range. And she was already shifting to new targets as their bodies fell. And the sharp cracks of her pistol punctuated the chaos like a drumbeat. Morvax fought beside her with brutal efficiency, his natural armor absorbing hits that would have killed the others. And he roared defiance as he drove back a Corveshi warrior with his bare hands. But there were 2. Manya Raider broke through the line and caught Morvax from behind with a blade that found the gap between his armor plates. And the Drethian roared in pain and stumbled forward. And another Corveshi raised its weapon for the killing blow. Jihei moved. The other cadets later struggled to describe what they saw, because she did not run toward Morvax so much as flow like water through the chaos of battle. And her pistol barked 3 times in rapid succession, and 3 raiders fell dead before they could react. She reached Morvax and caught him as he fell, and she dragged his massive body toward cover with one arm while firing with the other. And her face was calm, and her breathing was steady, even as death screamed around her. Get the door open, she shouted to Kethvaros. The instructor redoubled his efforts on the override, and the other cadets tightened their formation around the wounded Drethian. And Jihei stepped forward to meet the next wave of attackers. Alone, she reloaded in 1.2 seconds without looking at her hands. and she began firing again before the magazine had fully seated. And every shot found its target with surgical precision. The Corveshi hesitated. They were predators who had never encountered prey that fought like this. And they watched their warriors fall one after another to this small, soft creature, who moved like lightning and killed like a storm. And for the first time in their lives, they felt something unfamiliar fear. "Door is open." Kefers shouted. The cadets began falling back through the entrance. And Jihei covered their retreat with methodical fire that kept the raiders at bay. And she was the last one through before the door slammed shut behind her inside. They found 17 survivors huddled in the darkness. Researchers and technicians who had sealed themselves away when the attack began. And their eyes were wide with terror, and Relief Morvax lay on the floor with Eleni's pressing emergency sealant into his wound. And his 4 eyes found Jihei as she knelt beside him. "You came back for me," he said. And his voice was weak but filled with wonder. "Of course. Why, the mathematics favored leaving me. One casualty instead of risking the whole squad." Jihei checked her pistol and began reloading. "I do not fight with mathematics." "Then, what do you fight with?" She looked at him. And for a moment she was not a soldier or a cadet or a representative of humanity. She was just tired. "I fight with whenever I am left," she said quietly. "And I do not leave people behind. Not ever." Morvax stared at her. And something shifted in his expression. Something that went beyond fear or respect in the territory he had never expected to feel toward a human. "What are you?" he asked. Geisha offered her hand to help him sit up. "Tired," she said. "Just tired." From outside the sealed doors came the sounds of the Corveshi regrouping. And Kefros was already working on a plan to get the survivors to the transport. And there was still a long way to go before anyone was safe. But for now, in this moment, they were alive, and that was enough. The summons came 3 days after the demonstration, and Jihei found herself walking through corridors she had never seen before, past security checkpoints staffed by guards who watched her with expressions she could not read, until she reached a chamber high in the administrative tower of Vareth Prime Academy. Director Sarin waited for her there, and the ancient Quillith stood before a massive window that looked out upon the stars. And her long robes rustled softly as she turned to face the human who had disrupted her academy. The Quillith were among the oldest species in the coalition, and Sarin had served as director for longer than most civilizations had existed. And her eyes held the weight of millennia as she studied the small human female before her. "Cadet Yoon," she said, and her voice was like wind through autumn leaves. "Thank you for coming. I did not realize I had a choice." "Director." A faint smile crossed Soren's ancient face. "You did not. But I appreciate the courtesy of pretending otherwise. Please sit." Jihei took the offered chair, and she noticed that it had been adjusted to human proportions, which meant that Seren had prepared for this meeting carefully. The director remained standing, and she moved to a holographic display that floated in the center of the room. And with a gesture, she activated it. Images appeared in the air between them, and Jihei recognized them immediately. They were images of Earth. "I have been researching your species since the incident in the training hall," Sorin said, "and I must confess that what I found has disturbed me greatly." She waved her hand, and the images changed to show battlefields, war machines, mushroom clouds rising over devastated cities. "Humans have fought over 2,000 major wars in your recorded history," the director continued. "You developed weapons capable of destroying your entire planet, and then you kept building more. You have killed more of your own kind than most species encounter in their entire existence." Jihei said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Every word was true. "Your species achieved faster than light travel only 80 years ago," Seren added. "And yet your weapons technology rivals civilizations that have been spacefaring for thousands of years." You poured your greatest minds and resources into developing better ways to kill each other. And you succeeded beyond anything the Coalition has ever seen. The images faded. And Surin turned to face Jihei directly. I need you to explain something to me, Cadet. I need you to help me understand what humans are. Jihei was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. We are survivors, she finally said. Earth is what your people call a death world, high gravity, extreme weather, scarce resources, and constant competition. Everything on our planet evolved to kill or be killed, including us. Many species come from harsh worlds, not like ours, Director. Humans did not become the dominant species on Earth because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most armored. We won because we were willing to do whatever it took to survive. We developed tools and weapons because we had no claws. We developed tactics and strategy because we could not win through brute force alone. And we developed violence as an art form because it was the only way to overcome enemies that should have destroyed us. Surin listened without interrupting, and her ancient eyes never left Jihei's face. But here is what your research may not have shown you, Jihei continued. Humans also developed medicine to heal the wounds we inflicted. We developed art and music to express the emotions that war could not. We developed law and justice to restrain our worst impulses. And we developed compassion because we understood the cost of its absence. She leaned forward in her chair. The weapon is not the human. Director, the weapon is what the human chooses to do with their capabilities. We are capable of terrible destruction, yes, but we are also capable of incredible creation. And every day we make a choice about which path to walk. Surin was silent for a long time, and the stars wheeled slowly beyond the window. And finally she spoke. That is a beautiful answer, Cadet. But it does not address my central concern, which is, why should the Coalition trust you? Why should we welcome a species capable of such violence into our ranks? What guarantee do we have that humans will not turn those capabilities against us? Jihei met her gaze without flinching. You have no guarantee, Director, just as you have no guarantee that any species will not turn hostile. The Drethians fought 3 wars against the Coalition before joining. The Soren nearly destroyed themselves with biological weapons, and the Quillith, forgive me. But your own history includes the purging of the 7 worlds. Soren's expression flickered, but she did not deny it. Every species in the Coalition has darkness in its past, Jihei continued. The question is not whether we are capable of violence, but whether we are capable of choosing something better, and I believe humans are. I believe we joined the Coalition not because we needed new enemies to fight, but because we were tired of only fighting ourselves. And what do humans want from the Coalition? A purpose beyond destruction. A chance to use our skills for something greater than survival. We want to protect instead of conquer, to build instead of burn. We want to prove that we can be more than the monsters our history suggests. Surin turned back to the window, and her reflection in the glass looked older than the stars themselves. Those are noble words. Cadet, I hope they are also true. A soft chime interrupted them, and Surin moved to a communications panel and read the message that appeared there. And Jihei saw her ancient face grow grave. It seems we will have an opportunity to test your words sooner than expected, the director said. I have just received word that a Coalition outpost on the border has gone silent. The last transmission mentioned raiders before cutting off. She turned to face Jihei with new consideration in her eyes. A volunteer squad will be assembled to investigate. Instructor Kethvaros will lead, and I am recommending that you be included. Jihei stood and straightened her uniform. I am ready. Director, are you, Cadet? This will not be a demonstration or a training exercise. If there are raiders at that outpost, people will die, possibly including you. I understand. Surin studied her for another long moment, and then she nodded slowly. Go and prepare, Cadet Yoon. And I pray to whatever gods humans believe in that you are everything you claim to be." Jihei saluted in the human fashion. And then she turned and walked toward the door. And she was almost through it when Soren's voice stopped her. "Cadet." She turned back. "The Coalition has protected this region of space for 10,000 years. The director said softly. "We have faced threats that would have destroyed lesser civilizations, and we have always survived. But I find myself wondering now if perhaps we have been surviving the wrong way. If perhaps there is something humans can teach us about fighting for more than just existence." Jihei did not know how to answer that. So she simply nodded and left, but as she walked back through the corridors toward the cadet quarters, she felt the weight of those words settling on her shoulders like armor. The Coalition had given humans a chance to prove themselves. Now she would have to deliver. The training hall of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy stretched wide beneath artificial lights that mimicked the soft glow of a dozen different suns. And cadets from across known space stood in neat rows while Instructor Ketharos walked between them, with all four arms clasped behind his back. Ketharos was Soren, a species known for their centuries of combat experience and their absolute dedication to the art of war. And his scales had turned from bright green to dull gray over his long years of service. And his eyes missed nothing as he examined each student in turn. "Today we assess your proficiency with standard Coalition weapons," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "You will demonstrate accuracy, speed, and control. And I will determine which of you are ready to advance." The cadets shifted nervously, and Jihei stood among them, one of only 3 humans at the academy. And she kept her expression calm even as she felt the weight of alien eyes upon her. She was not tall by human standards, and certainly not impressive by galactic ones. And her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot. And her uniform fit her lean frame without any of the bulk or armor that other species wore. And to most observers, she looked fragile and out of place. Cadet Morvax stood 3 rows ahead of her, his massive Drethian body covered in natural armor plates that could stop a blade. And he glanced back at her with what passed for amusement among his kind, a slight widening of his 4 eyes and a rumble in his chest. The Vea Drethians had opposed human admission to the academy from the start, and Morvax made no secret of his belief that humans were prey animals who had somehow stumbled into space before they were ready. "First group, step forward," Ketharos commanded. The assessments began, and one by one cadets approached the firing line and demonstrated their skills with the standard Coalition pulse rifle. And some performed adequately while others excelled. And Ketharos noted each result on his datapad without comment. Cadet Elenice, a Velothi female whose crystalline skin caught the light in shifting patterns of blue and violet, scored well above average, and she returned to her place with quiet dignity. And her faceted eyes found Jihei briefly before looking away. Velothi were curious about humans in a way the Drethians were not. Neither hostile nor friendly, but simply watchful, as if waiting to see what these strange, soft creatures would do. When Morvax took his turn, he made a show of it, handling the rifle with practiced ease and striking every target with brutal efficiency. And he looked directly at Jihei as he finished, his message clear. "This is what strength looks like." His gaze seemed to say, "You do not belong here." Finally, Ketharos called Jihei forward, and she walked to the firing line with measured steps, and whispers followed her from the assembled cadets. "The human will embarrass herself," someone murmured. "Perhaps she will cry," another voice added with cruel amusement. Jihei reached the firing line and paused, and then she spoke in a clear voice that carried across the sudden silence. "Instructor, I request permission to demonstrate with my personal sidearm instead of the standard rifle." Ketharos turned all 4 of his eyes upon her, and for a long moment he simply stared. And then something like a smile crossed his scarred face. "You wish to use a human weapon," he said, and it was not a question. "Yes." "Instructor, the assessment requires standardized equipment for fair comparison." "I understand, Instructor. But I believe a demonstration would be educational for my fellow cadets." More whispers rippled through the crowd, and Morvax laughed openly, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the walls. "Let the human play with her primitive toy," he called out. "It will be amusing." Kethferos raised one hand for silence, and he studied Jihei with new interest, and after a moment he nodded. "Very well. Cadet Yoon, you may demonstrate your weapon, but you will still be graded on your performance with standard equipment afterward." "Understood." "Instructor." Jihei reached down to the holster at her hip and drew her sidearm, and to alien eyes it looked almost laughably simple. A small dark thing of metal and polymer that fit easily in her hand, and there were no glowing energy cells or humming power cores. Just clean mechanical lines. "What is that supposed to do?" Morvax asked loudly. "Make a loud noise and frighten us." Jihei ignored him and turned to face the targeting range, and the holographic targets stretched out before her at increasing distances. The farthest one placed at what the Coalition considered extreme range for personal weapons. "I will engage the far target," she announced as Kethferos checked his datapad, and his expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "That target is set at 300 meters. Cadet, well beyond the effective range of any sidearm in the Coalition arsenal." "I understand." "Instructor." She raised the weapon in a two-handed grip, and her breathing slowed, and her body became very still. And then she fired. The sound was unlike anything the alien cadets had heard before. A sharp crack that seemed to split the air itself, and the round crossed the distance so fast that the tracking sensors barely registered its passage, and the far target exploded into fragment. Silence fell over the training hall. Absolute and complete Tekos stared at his datapad, and then he checked the readings again, and then a third time, and his scales had gone pale. "That is not possible," he said quietly. "Instructor," Jihei asked, her voice still calm. "The velocity reading. It must be an error." "It is not an error, Instructor. That is the standard muzzle velocity for this weapon." Kethferos looked up from his datapad, and for the first time since Jihei had known him, the ancient warrior seemed uncertain. "What is the designation of this weapon?" "Cadet. It is a K5 pistol, Instructor. Standard issue for Korean military personnel." "Standard issue," he repeated, and his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Yes." "Instructor, this particular unit is 11 years old, and there are millions like it on Earth." No one spoke, and no one moved, and even Morvax had fallen silent. His earlier mockery forgotten, Jihei holstered her weapon with the same casual ease with which she had drawn it, and she walked back to her place in line, and she did not look at any of the staring faces around her. The assessment continued, and Jihei performed adequately with the standard Coalition rifle. Neither exceptional nor poor, just competent. And Kethferos recorded her scores without comment, but when the session ended and he dismissed the cadets, he did not leave the training island. Neither did many of the students. They lingered near the exits, their eyes on the human female who was gathering her things as if nothing unusual had happened. And Morvax stood among them with his 4 eyes narrowed in thought. And Alanis waited nearby with her crystalline face unreadable. "Cadet Yoon," Alanis called out, her voice like chimes in wind. "Would you permit us to examine your weapon more closely?" Jihei looked up, and she saw the crowd that had gathered, and she saw Kethferos watching from across the hall with his arms folded and his expression grave. "Of course," she said simply. She did not smile, and she did not boast, and she walked toward them with her hand resting lightly on her holster. And the aliens parted before her in a way they never had before. Something had changed in how they looked at her. And it was not respect, not yet, but it was no longer dismissal either. It was the beginning of fear. The training hall felt different after hours, with the main lights dimmed and only emergency strips glowing along the walls. And Jihei stood in a circle of alien cadets who watched her with expressions ranging from suspicion to fast nationalists. Had been the one to ask, but others had followed. And now nearly a dozen students surrounded the lone human, while Instructor Kethvaros observed from the shadows near the doorway. "Show us the specifications," Morvax demanded, his earlier mockery replaced by something harder and more urgent. This must be some kind of prototype or experimental weapon. No standard sidearm could perform like that. Jihei drew the pistol slowly, keeping her movements deliberate so no one would feel threatened. And she held it flat on her palm for them to see. "There is nothing experimental about it," she said. "This is a production model manufactured 11 years ago. And the serial number is stamped right here." She pointed to the markings on the frame, and Elenice leaned closer, her faceted eyes catching the dim light. "The manufacturing date matches what you said," the Velothi confirmed. "And the design appears quite simple compared to Coalition technology." "It is simple," Jihei agreed. "Humans have been making weapons like this for over 100 years. And we have refined the design over generations. But the basic principle remains the same." A Torvian cadet with mottled gray skin pushed forward, his tentacles waving with agitation. "But the velocity," he protested. "Our pulse weapons cannot match that speed. And we have been developing them for thousands of years." "Different approach," Jihei explained, keeping her voice patient and level. "Coalition weapons use energy projection, which is elegant and efficient. But human weapons use chemical propellants to accelerate a physical projectile. And the physics involved allow for extreme velocities." Morvax made a sound of disgust deep in his throat. "Primitive," he said. But there was no conviction in the word anymore. "Effective," Jihei corrected him gently. Elenice straightened and turned to face the group, and her crystalline features shifted in what might have been concern. "I have a question that troubles me," she said. "Why do humans need such weapons in the first place? What are you fighting that requires this kind of destructive capability?" The other cadets fell silent, and even Morvax leaned forward to hear the answer. Jihei was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "Each other, mostly." No one responded, and the words hung in the air like a physical weight. And Jihei saw the understanding dawn on their faces. One by one, humans had not developed these weapons to fight alien invaders or to defend against galactic threats. They had built them to kill other humans, and they had been doing so for their entire history. "That is," Elenice began, and then stopped, unable to find the right words. "Horrifying," Morvax finished for her. And for once there was no hostility in his voice. Jihei holstered her weapon and met their stares without flinching. "We are not proud of it," she said. "But it is who we are, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest." A long silence followed, and then Morvax stepped forward with a new look in his 4 eyes. Something that might have been challenge, but might also have been desperate hope. "I want to see more," he said. "Not just the weapon, but you. I want to see how fast you really are." "What do you propose?" "A reaction test. The standard academy drill where we draw and fire at appearing targets. My species can perceive and react in 0.4 seconds. And I have never lost this test to anyone." Jihei considered him for a moment, and then she nodded. "Very well." They moved to the firing station side by side, and the other cadets gathered behind them. And someone activated the targeting system while Kethvaros emerged from the shadows to watch more closely. "Standard rules," Morvax announced. "Targets appear randomly. First to hit 3 wins. Weapons stay holstered until the signal. Jihei checked her sidearm and returned it to the holster, and her hands hung loose at her sides. And her breathing was slow and even. Ready. Ready. The first target appeared with a flash of light, and Morvax moved with all the speed his warrior species could muster, his massive arm sweeping toward his weapon in a blur of armored muscle. Before his hand touched the grip, a sharp crack split the air Jihei had drawn, aimed, and fired in the time it took him to begin his motion. And the target shattered into glowing fragments. And she was already returning the pistol to its holster as Morvax finally cleared his weapon from its holder. 1-0. Someone whispered Morvs stared at her. And then he set himself again, and his eyes narrowed with fierce concentration. The second target appeared. The same thing happened. And Jihei fired before Morvax could even complete his draw, and the target exploded. And she was holstered again while he stood frozen with his weapon only half raised. 2-0. Sweat appeared on Morvax's brow despite the cool air, and his hands trembled slightly as he prepared for the third round. And the watching cadets had gone completely silent. The third target appeared. Jihei drew and fired twice, hitting both the target and a secondary target that appeared a fraction of a second later. And Morvax had not even begun to move before both were destroyed. Match complete, the system announced. Winner, Cadet Yun. No one spoke, and no one moved. And Morvax stood like a statue with his weapon finely drawn, but utterly useless. And his four eyes were wide with something that looked very much like terror-slow footsteps broke to silence. And Kepharos approached with his forearms clasped behind his back. And his ancient face was grave as he studied the human female who had just dismantled everything he thought he knew. About combat, he stopped beside Elenice and leaned close to her. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. But in the absolute quiet of the hall, everyone heard him. "It hits before you stand." Elenice turned to look at him. And he continued in that same hushed tone. "I ran the calculations on my datapad. From draw to impact takes her less than 0.2 of a second. Which means that if you were sitting down and tried to stand when she began her draw, a round would strike you before you reached your feet." The crystalline Velothi said nothing, but her faceted eyes found Jihei with new understanding. "How?" Morvax finally managed to ask, his voice rough. "How is this possible? You are soft. You have no armor, no claws, no natural weapons at all. How can you be this fast?" Jihei ejected the magazine from her pistol and began reloading with practiced ease. "Evolution," she said simply. "Humans are persistent predators. We evolved to track and exhaust our prey over long distances. But we also evolved to survive against faster and stronger creatures. And the only way to do that was to be quick and accurate when it mattered most." She slid the magazine home and holstered the weapon. "We had to be fast," she added, "because if we were slow, we died." Morvax looked at her. And then he looked at Kepharos, and then he looked at his own massive armored hands. "You hunt each other," he said slowly. "Millions of you, with weapons like that, for your entire history. Yes, and you survive. Some of us." The Drethian warrior set down his weapon and stepped back from the firing line. And when he spoke again, his voice held something it had never held before when addressing a human. "Respect. I understand now why your world is called a death world," he said. "It is not the gravity or the weather or the predators. It is you. Humans are what made Earth dangerous. Humans are the monsters of your own planet." Jihei did not argue with him. She could not, because he was right.